All right, let's dive into Genesis chapter 2. Now, you might think of this as just a continuation of the creation story, right? But it's actually so much more. Think of it almost like a blueprint for what it means to be human. It gets into our purpose, our relationships, and how we connect to something bigger. So, think about it. Chapter 1 gives us this grand, epic story of creation. The heavens, the earth, everything is made. But then what? The big question is, now that it's all here, how are we supposed to live in it? That's where chapter 2 comes in. It's not just a recap, it's basically the user manual for humanity.
Okay, so our first major discovery here revolves around a really simple-sounding idea, rest. But trust me, it's not just about taking a nap. The way the text presents rest, well, it reveals something incredibly profound about who we are and what we actually need to feel alive.
So after 6 straight days of creating literally everything, the story does something kind of unexpected. On day 7, God rests. And this is key. It's not just about being tired and taking a break. By blessing this day, by setting it apart as holy, a powerful rhythm is established right at the dawn of time. It's this fundamental pattern of work followed by sacred intentional rest. You know, the Hebrew word for this day is Shabbat, and it literally just means to stop, or to cease, to halt. It's not about being lazy or just sleeping in. It's an intentional decision to stop all our physical work. Why? To make room for something else. So, what is that something else? This is where it gets really interesting. The text lays out this kind of dual nature we all have. On one hand, we're told we're formed from the dust of the earth. You know, we're physical. We need food, water, shelter, all that material stuff. But then, we're also given the divine breath of life. That makes us spiritual beings with spiritual needs. And that right there, that's why you can have everything in the world materially, but still feel like something's missing. And you see this idea pop up again and again. This famous quote says it all. Man shall not live on bread alone. It's the perfect summary. Just like our bodies need food to survive, our spiritual side needs its own kind of nourishment. And that day of rest, that Shabbat, that's the time we're given to go find it. I love how the source material describes this. It calls the Sabbath a weekly flash of eternity. Think about that. It's like a sneak peek, a little rehearsal each week for a perfect world where all the struggle and striving is finally over. It's a way of connecting our chaotic lives right now to this promise of ultimate perfect rest. So this whole idea of our dual nature, physical and spiritual, and our deep need for connection, it leads us right to the setting of the story, the Garden of Eden. And Eden is way more than just a pretty place with some trees. It's actually the stage for a massive fundamental choice, a choice that basically defines what it means to be human. And the first clue is right in the name. In Hebrew, the word Eden actually means delight. How cool is that? God doesn't just stick humanity in a place to survive. He places them in a garden of delight. It's a place literally designed for a full life, for growth, for joy, and for connection. And right in the middle of this amazing garden of delight, you've got this central choice, symbolized by 2 very important trees. First, there's the tree of life. This one represents living in dependence on God, trusting in His wisdom and His way of doing things. But then there's the other one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And that one? It represents independence. It's the path of wanting to decide for ourselves what's right and wrong, to be wise in our own opinion. And this idea of dependence on a source is presented as absolutely foundational. The message is clear. Real life, real flourishing, it all comes from staying connected to that source. As another part of the text says, if you separate yourself from that source, well, you can't really do anything. You can't truly thrive. This deep human need to connect and to flourish, it isn't just about our spiritual connection. It flows right into our human relationships. And that brings us to our third big discovery from this chapter, the very first human partnership, and what it tells us about the origin and purpose of marriage.
So God Himself makes this incredible observation. He says, "It is not good for the man to be alone." Now think about that for a second. The man isn't technically alone, right? He's got God, he's got all the animals, but there's still something essential missing. There's a kind of aloneness that even a perfect relationship with the Creator doesn't seem to fix.
The story then builds this really cool sense of anticipation. God brings all the animals, one by one, to the man. And the man interacts with them, he gives them all names, but it becomes obvious that none of them are a real counterpart for him. It's this deliberate process, almost like a search, that really highlights just how unique and special the partner he actually needs is going to be.
And then, when the woman is finally brought to him, the man's reaction is just instant recognition. You can almost hear the relief in his voice. At last. He doesn't see another animal, another creature. He sees someone who is part of him, bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. He sees an equal, a true partner.
Now, here's a really fascinating take on this from the source material. It suggests that the woman wasn't just created for companionship, but to fulfill the man's deep need to be necessary to someone else. So the idea of marriage here isn't just about having a friend, it's about this deep mutual necessity, a relationship where each person is absolutely indispensable to the other.
Okay, so let's pull it all together. We've got these three huge fundamental lessons, right? The need for sacred rest, the power of choice, and the purpose of partnership. Let's take a quick look at how these three ideas weave together and really set the stage for, well, the entire human story that follows.
All right, to recap, we've seen how rest is the bridge that connects our physical lives to our spiritual source. We've talked about choice and how it puts us at this constant crossroads. Are we going to live in dependence on God or try to go it alone? And finally, we've seen that partnership is designed for this deep, powerful union built on mutual purpose. These aren't just dusty old ideas, you guys. They are principles that are woven into the very fabric of what it means to be human. And that really brings us full circle, right back to the garden. This ancient story describes a garden of delight, a place where humanity was designed to thrive. And how? Through rest, through wise choices, and through deep connection. So that leaves a pretty big question for us, doesn't it? In our world, which is full of distractions, constant work, and relationships that can feel so shallow, how do we find, and more importantly, cultivate our own garden of delight?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are ripping open one of the oldest foundational blueprints out there, Genesis chapter 2. And we're going to try and see what it says about, the very structure of human life. We're doing this especially for you, the listener, who might be coming to this completely fresh.
Right. Starting from scratch.
Exactly. Think of it as the ultimate origin story. We want to pull out the core insights about rest, choice, and human connection.
And that's our mission. The
Yeah.
source material, it really doesn't waste any time. It sets this overarching mandate right at the start.
The why this all matters?
Exactly. It quotes this ancient wisdom, saying the most important command is to love the Creator completely, heart, soul, and strength, and to teach these principles constantly.
At home, on the road?
When you're rising, when you're sleeping, it's not just history. It's meant to be a curriculum for living. So that's the frame.
I appreciate that context. Without it, chapter 2 can just look like, a detailed report. Okay, so let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
It follows the huge creation story, but then the perspective shifts. It zooms way in.
It does. It focuses right in on humanity's environment and purpose. So we're zeroing in on three big discoveries today.
Which are?
The institution of the day of rest, the specific meaning of this garden of delight, and, the original purpose of human connection and marriage.
Okay. So it takes the big bang of creation and really brings it down to a human level.
Yeah, it settles it down. It answers that question. So what does our existence actually look like in this brand new world?
Let's start with what some of the commentators call the first weekend.
Right.
The first few verses say the whole creation, heavens, earth, everything was done. But then we get this detail that, it has literally reshaped civilization.
The seventh day.
On the seventh day, the Creator finished his work, and the text says he rested from his labor.
And this isn't about being tired. It's not divine exhaustion. It's a very deliberate action.
Okay, so what's the point of it?
Well, the text highlights two monumental things that happened. First, God blessed the seventh day.
And second,
He declared it holy, set it apart. It wasn't just a pause. It was built into the structure of time as something sacred.
Now, before we get to the man being fully, functional, the scene is described almost like a landscape that's waiting.
Yeah, waiting to be activated.
It says no wild plants or grain grew yet. And the reason is twofold. No rain and no person to cultivate the earth.
Right, just springs coming up from the ground.
And this sets the stage for humanity's entrance, which reveals our basic makeup.
Verses 4 through 7. It says, the Lord God formed man from the dust of the earth.
Our physical part,
Right.
the stuff of this world.
Exactly. And then he breathed the breath of life into his nostrils.
And that made man a living being. But hang on, the animals from chapter 1 were also called living creatures.
Good care.
So what's different here? What does this specific mix mean for us?
That's the crucial question. And the wisdom writers jump right on it. What's established here is a double nature.
Okay, a double nature.
We are fundamentally physical dust, meaning we're tied to this world, to time, space, all of that.
And decay.
And decay, right. But we're also spiritual, connected directly to that divine breath.
Okay, so what does this mean for us?
Well, the text highlights two monumental things that happened. First, God blessed the seventh day. And second, He declared it holy, set it apart. the soul.
So the human project is kind of split from the get-go.
Inherently split. The physical part feeds on the earth, but the spiritual side needs a whole different kind of nourishment.
So if we're part dust and part divine breath, why spend 6 whole days working on the physical world? Doesn't that imply the dust part is, I don't know, less valuable?
Not less valuable, just temporary. The sources often say the body is the temporary habitation of the soul.
A temporary home.
Right. And the material world is where we work, where we develop things for 6 days. But that 7th day, the Sabbath, is required because of our dual nature.
So what does the word Shabbat actually mean?
It means to stop, to cease, or to detain oneself. It's the scheduled time to make sure the spiritual half doesn't starve.
I see. So the first 6 days are for the physical work, development, perfection, all that.
And the 7th day, that's for the connection of the physical with the spiritual. It's the time to recognize that, as the commentators say, man lives not only by bread.
But by every word that comes from the mouth of God. I know that one.
That's the one.
Yeah.
It's designed as this perpetual memorial to the Creator, reminding us that we're dependent, we're not self-sufficient.
That makes the Sabbath sound a lot less like a chore and more like a necessary battery recharge for the soul.
That's a great way to put it.
The sources connect this to an idea called the glimpse of eternity, right?
They do. It's often called an essay or a glimpse of eternity. The idea is that when all our earthly work stops, we enter a state that kind of foreshadows perfection, completeness,
A practice run.
a weekly practice for our ultimate destiny, which is to dwell in that final rest with the Creator.
So really, it's about scheduling our priorities, intentionally stopping the chase for material stuff 1 day a week to reconnect with that original divine breath.
Okay, so now that we have humanity's nature and this mandate for spiritual rest, let's look at the stage where all this drama is going to unfold.
The garden.
The garden. The Lord God planted it in a place called Eden.
And that name is important. From the Hebrew, it literally means delight.
Yes, delight. He placed the man there. So this wasn't some harsh survival test. It was an environment designed for pleasure and beauty.
And we get these really specific geographical markers, which almost feel like they're trying to ground the story in the real world.
Absolutely. A single river flows out of Eden, and it splits into 4 major branches: Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. This was the lifeblood of the whole place.
And the text even points out the local resources. Near the Pishon, there's gold.
And not just any gold, exceptionally pure gold.
Right. And aromatic resins, onyx stone.
Hmm.
It's painting a picture of immense value and reality.
It is. But once the man is in this garden of delight, he immediately gets his job description and the one critical rule.
The rule that sets up, well, pretty much everything that follows.
The rest of human history, yeah.
So his job was to care for the garden and, interestingly, to guard it.
And then came the command, which was framed as this incredible freedom, but with just one boundary.
You can eat from every single tree in the garden.
Except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
And the consequence was spelled out.
Perfectly clear. If you eat of its fruit, you will surely die.
Now, what's fascinating here is how the ancient commentaries interpret this. They say it's not really about the physical fruit, is it?
Not about the chemistry of the fruit, no. It represents a core philosophical choice for humanity.
So you have 2 symbolic trees.
You have the tree of life, which symbolizes seeking all your life, your wisdom, your sustenance, only in God, the source.
And then you have the other one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Which the sources present as a kind of deception.
What's the nature of that deception?
It's the call to independent self-sufficiency.
The idea that you don't need the source.
Right. It suggests that humanity could just seize wisdom for itself, decide right and wrong on its own, and, cut itself off from the root that sustains it.
So the physical death that was promised
Was just the final symptom of the spiritual separation that was already chosen.
That distinction is so powerful, reliance versus independence. And the commentaries then take this huge leap, connecting this initial failure to a much later context. We should probably clarify for a new listener, this next part is interpretive. It's not in Genesis 2.
That's a vital point. The later wisdom texts reflect on this damage, and they say that this death, caused by trying to be independently wise, would later be fixed.
By the word or the vine.
The same one who created everything in the first place. This figure would become the new tree of life.
So the failure in the garden required an equal and opposite act of perfect obedience to fix it.
Precisely. His perfect obedience and suffering, being, as they say, nailed to a tree, is seen as the complete reversal of that death sentence. It's the chapter that has to follow to make sense of the stakes of that first choice.
Okay, so we've got rest, We've got choice. But right after that command, the text introduces the third core concept by stating something that the Creator says is not good.
Which is a huge deal because up to this point, everything has been good.
And his declaration is short and revolutionary. It is not good that the man should be alone.
Right.
Now, this is often misunderstood. I mean, he wasn't physically alone, was he? God was there. The animals were there.
No, he wasn't physically alone. The insight from the sources is so human. It says he lacked someone for whom his life was necessary and indispensable.
Wow.
He needed a relationship where his existence was actually required for the well-being of another human. It was an existential solitude.
And the story proves this with the whole animal naming process.
It does. God brings every animal to the man to be named. And you have to imagine this was a huge task.
But it wasn't just about cataloging them.
No, it was a demonstration. The man names every single creature, but the text says that after all that searching, an ideal helper was still missing.
The animals just couldn't fill that need.
They couldn't. They couldn't be indispensable to him in the same way because they weren't of the same essence.
And that sets the stage for the creation of woman. God causes a deep sleep, takes a rib,
And then, I love this detail, she is presented to the man.
and his reaction is the first poetry in the whole text. It's this outburst of recognition.
This bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, Isha, because she was taken from man, Ish.
He sees himself in her, that shared indispensable essence.
Exactly. And the text concludes that this is why a man leaves his parents, joins his wife, and the two become one sole entity.
So the practical purpose of this union is really specific.
It is. The sources say the woman was created to help the man satisfy that deep, fundamental need to feel useful and necessary for someone else, to solve the not good to be alone problem.
Which has some pretty immediate relevance today.
It does.
If the goal of the relationship is to overcome that existential solitude, it's not just about comfort, it's about mutual dependency.
Precisely. The advice you can pull from this is clear. If you actively make your partner feel necessary and indispensable, you keep them motivated to love and to be their best self. It feeds a core human need.
And the chapter ends with that beautiful, poignant scene. The man and his wife were naked.
But felt no shame. Total transparency, total acceptance before that critical choice was made.
Okay, so we've done this deep dive for the listener who's maybe coming in cold. What are the key takeaways from this ancient blueprint?
I think we've established the foundational structure. First, humanity has a spiritual destiny and requires scheduled rest, the Shabbat, to nourish the soul.
Right. And second, we live in a place of choice, in Eden, where our reliance on the Creator is constantly tested by the temptation to go it alone.
And third, humanity is just fundamentally incomplete without indispensable partnership marriage, which is designed to satisfy that deep need to be necessary to another person.
All three seem to build on each other.
They do. The whole grand narrative of the text flows from these three elements. The quality of a person's life is determined by how they navigate them.
Their dedication to rest, their choice of wisdom, and their commitment to relationship.
Exactly.
So as we close, let's circle back to where we started, that dual nature of dust and breath. We saw how our purpose is tied to being indispensable, and our spiritual health is tied to stopping work. So this raises an important question for you to mull over until our next deep dive. If your spiritual health depends on being both dependent on the Creator and indispensable to your partner or community, which of those two connections do you find yourself prioritizing? Seeking reliance or achieving necessity? And how might you better balance them this week?
That's something to carry with you.